Yes, good morning. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the committee. And it's really a real honor and pleasure to talk to all of you here today. As mentioned, my name is Moritz Stefaner, and I'll talk about the art and science of data visualization today, which is sort of a recurring theme in my practice. In fact, I have a love-hate relationship with both, so I just keep switching sides. And for this talk, I really wanted to go back a bit to the fundamentals and the roots, both of my practice and also my fascination with data visualization. And I thought about what is it that excited me at the beginning and what keeps exciting me and how can the future look like, right? And I realized, looking back into my archive, that the first proper interactive data visualization I probably produced was 20 years ago, so it's sort of a little anniversary for me as well. And it was just this little organic link widget I built for my website. I had no idea I was actually doing data visualization at the time. I just thought it was maybe fun to navigate the linkage across my friends' websites in an interesting way, right? But now I recognize so much this need that I'm still sort of hunting for fluid, dynamic exploration of information spaces, right? And that sense of I can look wherever I want. It's all coming together in a nice way. And it's sort of fun because I had no clue at the time what I was actually doing. But now I recognize what path it opened for me, basically. I then went to the University of Osnabrück. In my mid-20s, actually, I started studying only, so I did a lot of different stuff before. And I studied cognitive science to investigate how the mind works, how the brain works, how we deal with information, how digital media works. So I was very interested in that. And still I draw a lot from these years. In my bachelor's thesis, I focused actually on data mining and machine learning, something that's now very hip right now. Investigated how large text collections could be made more accessible with 2D maps, projection techniques. We had nothing at the time. We didn't have Disney, we didn't have UMap, we had to do Salmon's mapping, but you know, it's a recurring thing. At the same time, I was also really getting hooked on tangible data visualization. So as part of a study project, we built this haptic compass that would vibrate the north direction to your waist. And so we did experiments on wayfinding and orientation with this sort of self-made device, which we gave to people to wear for 6 weeks straight, which is kind of a crazy long-term study, I think. But it was really interesting thing about sensory substitution and sort of sensory enhancement through technology, right? And so here, this belt prototype. And then moved to University of Applied Sciences in Potsdam, worked with Professor Boris Müller, who is still a big mentor to me. And got, again, really excited about making information spaces more fluidly navigable and really tangible. Played a lot with loose information structure, multidimensional classification, stuff like this. And sort of fast forwarding now 15 years, I then successfully quit sort of a half-baked academic career in 2008, decided to go full freelance, just doing projects. And since then, I've done really hundreds of data visualization projects in all kinds of contexts, very small, very big, very artistic, very applied, industry, research. It's been a wild mix, sort of. And so I think I've seen a lot of flavors and styles and uses of data visualization. And as I said, some of my projects are really super highly applied and effective, and others just push the boundaries of what it means to visualize data today. And I hope I can show you a bit of the spectrum of that today. I also run, currently a bit on hiatus, unfortunately, but I hope we can pick it up again, a podcast called Data Stories together with Enrico Bertini, who many of you will know, where we together discuss the role data plays in our lives. Maybe there's some listeners out there, potentially. Or new listeners after this talk, who knows? So, starting also from the beginning for the topic of the talk, let's start at the basics, right? What is the purpose of visualization? And I think all of you have something in mind that's insights, not pictures, because I think that's what we believe in. And I think all of us have told this story a few times. We make data legible through visual encoding. We reveal patterns through the power of visual computation. And one thing I really like to tell people is who still haven't quite gotten what the appeal is, I always say you can see the forest and the trees at the same time, right? And that's often when it clicks for people, and they're like, oh yeah, I like that. I think that's what we're missing, or it's something everybody wants to have, right? And I think that's the big promise we make. We reveal these big patterns in data, but we still give access to all the details that make up a big data set and all the diversity that goes into an aggregate number, right? And I think there's a functional benefit to this, right? Overview first, details on demand. There's an economy to that. But it's also about that subjective feeling of just floating over the world peacefully and having everything under control, you know, and everything's visible. I think that it also has something to do with our personal sensation and feeling and emotion at that point in time, that we enjoy seeing a big map of something where somebody says, that's a complete overview of something. It's just very soothing. And this emotional factor, that's something that will come back today. And talking about feelings and the forest and the trees, one project that really clicked for me in that sense was Jonathan Harris and Seb Camber's web art project, We Feel Fine, from 2006. It's unfortunately offline by now. It was a Java applet, so we had to talk yesterday by Tobias Eisenberg on media conservation. I hope all of you take that serious and think about if your visualization lives on in 10, 20 years. It's hard, but it's worthwhile. So this project is brilliant, but it's offline, right? So I can show you screenshots and a little screen cap later. What they did is they searched the internet every 10 minutes for expressions of human emotion on blogs. Basically, people had blogs back at the time. And then displayed the results of all the feelings they collected and harvested, basically, in several really visually rich dynamic representation in the form of little particles. I think that whole genre is very well known by now to do a particle-based visualization, and the particles can arrange in different charts. So here you can see all the better, bad, good feelings, like the quality of the different feelings and how many individual items were collected there. So you see these big patterns, but at the same time, you also had access to all the little stories that made up this big data set. And you get a sense of, oh, there's a person behind of each this thought and a complex feeling we're sort of now really simplistically putting into this little icon, right? And this tension becomes very apparent between that complex world that opens behind each of these data dots and the aggregations you do. And I like a lot the details of this project. For instance, this unknown age group here forms this question mark, and it's huge, right? It's very prominent. It's just being very open about the gaps and biases of your data, which we don't see much today, even, right? And it was sort of clear to them they would have to do that. Then there's all these beautiful metaphors, like feelings during sunny, cloudy, snowy weather were arranged in different behaviors, actually, of these particles, fitting that weather, like a very poetic way to think about data presentation. And these little histogram bombs were just cute. You'll see them in the video. They sort of wobble around in a really nice way. So we just have some pretty choppy screen recordings, and I need to get in touch with the authors if they have better ones. But you get a sense of how it worked. So you could, in the beginning, just randomly browse all this mess, basically, of feelings and just pick out individual ones. Or you could go through these different aggregations of sorts. The one we've seen, like by the type of feeling, or other aggregations, and these really, really joyful little histogram humps. And you can sort of dive into each subsection of the data set and do these visual queries. So you could say, show me feelings from people who feel better and are, I don't know, women in their 40s, stuff like this. So you could do these arbitrary drill downs in the data. And at the same time, it's a really playful and joyful experience. And I think very respectful to the topic at hand, right? By really being mindful about the visual encoding and the whole user experience chosen, right? Really smart, very complete project. The data also had an API you could use. You could just use the back end of the visualization. There was a book version of it. It's this complete Gesamtkunstwerk, basically, that came together here. And yeah, I think it's one of the forgotten works that really nailed data visualization in many ways and that I keep coming back to mentally. And Also because to me, what it encapsulates so brilliantly is this other idea by Joël de Resnais, which resonated with me at the time deeply, is that like we have a telescope to see the very far things and a microscope to see the very small things. Data visualization might actually provide us with a macroscope to investigate the infinitely complex, right? Human nature, society, all the things that would otherwise not be even graspable or tractable to work with at a large scale, right? And so it's almost like this new kind of glasses to see the world through, like arbitrary types of goggles we can suddenly wear to make sense of the world under a specific perspective. And at the same time, this very opinionated, flavored, personal, subjective presentation of this we will find data set, right? You can clearly see an authorship in how the tool is built, right? Made it clear that we're very far away from a lab situation or a strict scientific analysis, but really more in the realm of art, entertainment, pop culture, coming with a personal view and really caring about the experience of people. And to me, and I think also generally, this sort of led to the recognition that even interactive, exploratory data visualization comes with a viewpoint, an attitude, baked-in biases, priorities, editorial decisions, and that interactive, dynamic data visualization is in fact sometimes best understood not as a tool or a device, but actually as a medium for expression and communication, because whenever people are involved, and information is conveyed between people, there's some mediation happening, and we need to think about the character of these media and what they do, and how they affect the content of what's being communicated in the end. And a media can do this really powerful thing, as so wonderfully illustrated in Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, where they can not literally, but figuratively, grab somebody by the shoulder, guide them to the right spot, and tell them, you are here, and now look there, right? This is the perspective I'm presenting you with. You do the looking, but I provide that frame and that position, that viewpoint, that vantage point, right? And that's the media angle on any data visualization. Even the most exploratory, open ones is always this framing that's happening. And fundamentally, it needs that we fundamentally acknowledge that this mediation is happening and that this process needs to be designed, that frame needs to be built. It doesn't just disappear, it's always there, right? And I was again reminded of all this when I was just seeing a few weeks ago this New York Times visualization, which also came up in the discussion yesterday, on the 1 million COVID deaths, right? How do you convey a tragedy of that size in numbers and charts? What is an appropriate visualization here? This is not just a matter of picking the right chart type or encoding strategy. It's a communication exercise that requires nuance and the right tone, the right attitude, right? And what they decided is, so they ran a couple of pieces, but in one, they decided to include some of the personal stories that made up these huge numbers and the patterns we can see in the data, told from a perspective of those left behind, basically talking about all these lives lost and what the people were like that went into this huge data set, right? In other stories, they decided to do pretty straightforward graphs, but built again from particles, remember we will find, that each represented one deceased person. And I think it's very clear the goal here is not just to show statistical patterns, right? But to convey empathy, and I guess also to show the messiness of the whole situation, right? So there's a lot happening between the lines that goes beyond the literal chart type or encoding choices. Taking this approach even further, Susanne Furstenberg created a physical installation representing each deceased person as a white flag. And this installation really puts the spectator in the middle of that huge number, right? To make it a bit more graspable, if possible at all, what 1 million deaths actually looks like. Now, the interesting thing is, I think that's a great visualization. But the encoding is trivial. It's one flag per person. There's no pattern here. It's just a huge number. It's a huge number shown huge, right? And there's really no insight you could literally point to and say like, oh, I wouldn't have learned that hadn't I looked at this visualization. So I'm wondering, is it a bad visualization? Is it even a visualization? Or is it a great visualization and we just lack the vocabulary to talk about what makes it great? Do we have the theory to explain why this works, right? Let me give you another example. And here's a funny cross-connection because this graphic is from Angela Morelli, who will talk on Friday. I should tell her. And it's from the 1.5 degrees IPCC report. And she and Tom, they have been working on the graphics there. And it shows in great detail the observed and projected global temperatures, different scenarios, model ranges, annotations. It's technically very well crafted. It's a really well-made piece of information design, right? But when I talked to them back when the report came out, I remember having a debate about it, and I was really making this point that I said, this is great work, don't get me wrong, but I think we need more iconic work to get through to people, right? It's not enough to just be right and correct. We need to think about communication here, like how can we be more bold and not so tame and sober in the communication, because the situation is sort of calling for it. And funnily, just very soon after we had this discussion, the most capturing and iconic design possible made the rounds. The now famous warming stripes by this guy, Ed Hawkins, who's a climate scientist, not a data viz expert, not a designer of data visualizations typically. He sort of became one through his practice. But this is not where he started, and that's not his background. And I think it's sort of a stroke of genius. It's at the Reading Festival on stage, right? And it's really an unprecedented success when it comes to the impact of data graphics. I think it might be the most successful data visualization of the last 10 years, maybe, right? And the climate movement might be the first movement to have a data-driven visual identity, right? We find it in train stations in Germany. It's even being impersonated on demonstrations. So there's a whole field of data clothification apparently emerging right now. It's being used in remixes. It really has become a meme of sorts, right? It sort of transcended its own genre. It became a sign, a logo, a branding device, basically. And I think there's something really quintessential about that and really interesting that's happening here. And again, I can make this point, right? Technically, it's not a great visualization, technically speaking, probably. You know, color for quantitative information, we know the rankings. And so I think that's so interesting, right? And maybe in a course, if a student had made it, maybe you would have been quick to dismiss it as, yeah, try again. It might have been a line chart, right? But it does something that the line chart does not do. And what is it? And can we explain that? And in which framework can we explain it? That's what I'm now interested in, right? And so it does this really powerful thing, even transcending its own genre, becoming an icon, a symbol, a logo, a sign for an idea, for a fact, basically. And again, there's no great insight or pattern really to be seen, or the pattern you look at is actually secondary. What's primary is the act of communication, right? The mere fact that these colors are somewhere make climate change present. The medium is becoming the message. It becomes a vehicle for a whole thought, but the data sort of steps back in that context. And I think that's really interesting what's happening here. Can be a symbol for an idea. I think a great data visualization can even become an interface for an idea, so you can interact with it. Here's a 10-year-old project from mine. Because back in the day, in 2012, OECD commissioned Agency Raureif and me to come up with a new visualization for the Better Life Index to really capture multiple dimensions about a country, such as income, jobs, happiness, health, you know, the whole spectrum of things you could look at. And usually OECD is more known for putting out big reports with lots of tables and bar charts. But for the Better Life Index, they were seeking something actually more intriguing and inspiring, right? And so we came up with this flower visualization. Each petal would represent one dimension. Glyph design, I can say it in this context, it's always nice. And the glyph is one thing, but the other important part was really the interaction and the personal perspective. So instead of prescribing a specific ranking, we gave users the chance to pick their own priorities, right? So you would start out equally weighted, everything's equally important, but then you could say, oh, I want to bump up civic engagement, then Australia and Sweden rise to the top, or you prioritize income as well, then United States and Luxembourg catch up. And so by changing the weights here, you can dynamically explore how that affects that dynamic ranking, and the graphic adjusts, right? The graphic not only displays the result, but also the process by making these petals more visible or less visible, and so on. And so it's actually a very, very playful and simple way into a quite multidimensional, complex data set. But people didn't even notice they were exploring something as complex as these two vector spaces and dot products and whatnot, right? And so I think it was interesting that even 10 years ago, it was really possible to do something really complicated and complex if you had this iconic and playful and really personal design, right? Again, without even noticing, people were suddenly exploring multidimensional information space. The other thing that this design achieves is something that we have observed quite a bit over these years, is that people took the information really personal. So they didn't think about what does it mean for the countries or the governments or whatever, but it's more like, what does it mean for me, right? And quite often we had these tweets that said, oh, the OECD says I should move to Australia, right? Nobody said that, but people thought about it when they were using the tool, created their own version of that index and made it theirs, right? It's this IKEA effect that once you assemble something yourself, it has value to you personally, and suddenly you have a different relationship to the data at hand. And also looking back, I think I can proudly say that internally this design has changed that organization, right? And every new product is sort of presented on every new communication effort against that backdrop of the Better Life Index. And I think that is also because it expressed a new view of the world, a new view of this organization, a shift in mindset towards more openness, different perspectives, you know, just this general idea that not everything can be prescribed, maybe, and it's captured in that visual model. So that visual model becomes, again, a symbol, but also an interface in that case, really, to this general idea. I think that's something really powerful. If we think about mental models and how we conceptualize things, how we construct knowledge, is that idea that interactive data visualization can give you suddenly direct access to the mechanics, actually, of an idea. So powerful. And that's what I'm really after in my work, like by really crafting carefully these tailored, intriguing, unique data experiences. I really hope that we can establish new languages, really. I think that's what we're after in the end, is to create new languages and new cultures and new ways to talking and think about the world. But again, that all starts with language. And if we stay in that metaphor, the whole spectrum of language, not just syntax and semantics, but also pragmatics, social linguistics, speech act theory, all the soft, difficult parts, right, that make language what it is. Yeah, and it's always interesting to explore the boundaries and fringes of that language. So one example is this data cuisine workshop series I run together with Susanne Jaschko, where we explore together if food can be a medium for information as well, right? So we've seen data sculptures, we've seen charts, graphs, interactive media. Why not food? Food is nice. And so we, to find out, we have this series of workshops. We team up with local chefs and workshop participants in different cities to tell local data stories through local food, actually, right? And it's always a 2-day workshop. We first explore what are interesting data stories to tell about the place. We sketch ideas for data dishes representing these data stories, and then it's sort of from brainstorming to food storming, and the whole kitchen is a big mess. And then a lot of care obviously goes into the presentation and the explanation of the dish and the title and whatnot to round it up. And then at the end, there's always a data dinner or a data buffet where we taste the creations. And this is actually where the visualization happens, in that social setting. And basically in the moment, and once you bite into something, right? That's the moment where it actually happens. And just to give you an idea about the outcomes, so we had many data dishes, but here's just a few. So here are gin tonics from Belgium, and here the number of these little beads indicates the number of inhabitants near a nuclear power plant in Belgium. And of course, the design sort of evokes these cooling rods and this sort of nuclear atmosphere, right? It's very like graspable, this sort of topic. Here's the energy mix in Switzerland, where only 15% of energy consumed comes from renewable resources, and so this pizza chart is like sort of covered in carbon, like coal, basically, to symbolize all the non-renewables or the fossil fuels. Some topics are also a bit bittersweet, as can be seen in this death by chocolate pralinés, which visualizes the statistics of the causes of death in Belgium in the form of small coffins, little coffin pralinés. And Aline Bird, the designer, made one per participant of the workshop. And basically, it's a little lottery. The casket is closed, and you just pick one, and it's sort of your personal lottery ticket that you draw. And I think it's a bit dark, but it's also a really interesting way to look at risk and personal statistical data, right? It's a very smart way to think about this probabilities in a way. Yeah, and so what's happening here, right? I mean, you could say it's really small data. It's just 2 or 3 numbers, and people spend a whole weekend cooking them, right? So it's really atomic in that sense. But they go deep. These numbers go deep, because if you think about 2 or 3 numbers for a whole weekend and you taste them together, you don't forget them, right? They stay with the people. So it's a really small data set, but experienced very deeply and very richly. Food is so association rich, right? Every single ingredient, every dish will remind you of something. It has cultural meaning. Potatoes or caviar, it's whole worlds that suddenly appear. And so it makes it this really, really rich cultural language. And yeah, it's sort of this total sort of flip side of doing huge data sets with anonymous identical dots is this 2 data points, but in a really, really deep way, right? The other thing it does is it creates what I like to call data situations. So it sets up a certain space, a certain disposition of things to happen, right? It's situated data, human scale, there's people. Let's see what happens. Let's see what are the conversations that emerge. Let's see where this takes us, right? So by setting up a situation, you just create a starting point. It's not an end point. You just set the frame for something interesting to happen. And so you could say it's not sort of a fact, sort of set in stone that we present, but it's more a catalyst for conversation. Once you have food together, you start to talk. And if the food has a topic, you start to talk about the topic, right? And again, that's this form of mediation between people where the data and the data representation just becomes that device for the actual conversation to happen. And finally, and that's the simplest point here, the mere fact that abstract data suddenly gets literally graspable, tangible, and in this case, even digestible, is something we're really longing for as humans, right? This feeling of, suddenly I have something concrete in my hands. Thank God, We live in so much abstract spaces that this physical, haptic, rich experience of data is something that people just enjoy by themselves, whatever the data represents. It's, and so I think that makes it so powerful. And I think it's not it's not a coincidence that all of our language metaphors for understanding something have to do with grasping, touching, gripping. In German, it's even stronger with the begreifen. It's really, it's all about tangibility and graspability there, the thinking process. So here we are, food data. And you might say, rightfully, I'm sorry, Moritz, I can't always cook or dance the weekly sales figures now, But let me show you how this basic idea can also be used in other contexts, because it's just about the philosophy, you don't have to do a 2-day cooking workshop to apply these ideas. And for instance, so here's the Impf dashboard. It's German for the vaccination dashboard that I've been working on together with Studio Nantes in Berlin over the last year, where we present the official German vaccination statistics. And I'll show you a quick scroll through the site so you get a sense of what's happening. But overall, our goal here is really to present the most important official vaccination statistics in a super concise, appealing, and widely accessible way. our target group was basically everybody in Germany. So we had to really make sure everything gets across as crisp and clear as possible, because it was a very heated situation in terms of communication. So we needed to let the facts speak. And we also wanted to have a low threshold, a low entry barrier to this data sets, because otherwise we don't reach everybody, right? And so on top, we start here with the key statistics, like how many people are vaccinated, how many doses have been administered, what was the weekly trend, like these are the things the nerds always want to know on a daily basis, so we put it on the top of that. The next thing is a text, a data-driven text that says exactly the same thing. And you might be like, why are you saying the same thing twice? The thing is, the text works better for some people. Not everybody's into charts, right? And the text is misunderstandable. It's very explicit. You can add a bit more nuance and detail. You can copy-paste it. You can screenshot it. I actually love text. It's weird as a data visualization expert, but especially the combination of text and charts is just the best. When you scroll down, you'll see a fairly unique feature. It's a vaccination clock, basically, that tells you how many people are currently vaccinated per second if we were to spread the vaccinations equally across the day. So that's about the gut feeling for the speed. And then you get a lot more detailed statistics, like each section always then looks at one breakdown of the data, be it regional, be it by age group, be it by all other attributes people might be interested in. And now, I think there's a few interesting things about the site, but what I want to focus on here now is this way we show the same data sets, doses over time, and in a couple of different ways across the site. So the clock shows you only the latest data point. It's just one data point. What's the current vaccination speed? But does that in that metaphor with the clock, right? The weekly chart shows you 7 days, last 7 days, small slice, and the full timeline shows you the different types of vaccinations over all time, right? The big pattern, the forest. And again, you might say, why show the same thing 3 times? You see the latest data also in the big chart. Why not just show the big charts? The point is, these 3 forums achieve wildly different things on a cognitive level, but also on an emotional level, right? They just address different cognitive and emotional needs. And the clock itself is, again, clearly the most imprecise way, or data inc ratio-wise, the worst way. It's a whole section of the website just for one number, ultimately, right? And some people might know I sometimes complain about number decoration as a practice, which I don't appreciate. I think you could call this number decoration in a way. You know, it's a lot of graphics around a single statistics. But what it achieved was it gave people a gut feeling for the speed of vaccination. How fast is it actually to have 200,000 people in Germany? Is that a lot or not, right? And especially give you a feeling across days, because people, when it's on a human scale, like close to the seconds that we usually observe on a clock, they have suddenly a very fine sense of, I think yesterday it was a bit faster, or it was a bit slower, and they were usually right. And that's really interesting, because many people just don't have a good relation to 6 figures or 7-figure numbers, or can't even remember them, but they do have a relation to, is it a bit faster than my usual clock or not, right? And so, again, this was, of course, also the website that, the part of the website that drew all the commentary and all the reactions. And some people said, maybe I'm starting to get strange, but I like to watch the vaccination clock for a few minutes. Good news for in between. So you can see it's not just about the information that's presented, that people actually had the feeling of something's constantly moving forward, right? It's, again, what's happening between the lines, what is communicated beyond that statistic, right? Other people spend a whole day staring at the vaccination clock, apparently. So this hypnotic quality, right, can get you into a meditative state of sorts, maybe, if you just look at the loop all the time. And of course, you always also get the other side. Some people are furious because it's pure propaganda, where then, we lie with statistics and we just do this to make things look good, right? And that's, of course, always the suspicion if you do some unusual data presentations that, you're just doing that to manipulate people. But yeah, as we all know, real manipulation with data is much more subtle than that. I wouldn't make a big clock if I wanted to really lie with data. So again, you can see it's all about the emotions that are elicited by that little piece on that side. Other things, I think, again, from a media point of view, I think was interesting that we were commissioned to do a dashboard, basically, but then we said, well, we make a whole data platform, and our data should happen everywhere, right? It's 2022. It's not that, yeah, the dashboard is, I think, not really a contemporary form of information display. That's a whole other talk. But one thing we did is, for instance, have the live previews, or have the previews on Twitter. When you link to the website, we're always up to date with the latest data. So we ran scripts to constantly regenerate these scripts. So basically, we spread our latest number to the Twitter platform through that preview. And I think that's a very modern thought of thinking about, well, our data presentation doesn't happen just in one place. It's actually everywhere. Like, we live in a distributed world. Even the fav icon that you use to bookmark the site, even that is the latest 7 days of data. So that's a weird nerd flex, but we went there just to prove our street credibility. The other thing we thought a lot about is really accessibility and inclusiveness, also in terms of accessibility literally, but also internationalization. So it's translated to the 4 most spoken languages in Germany. And I think these are all things you have to now think about if you want to get data out there, right? And I think, the whole site went through a lot of iteration, was a very fluid product. And I think generally that also means we're moving away from a world where we can just talk about one chart at a time and really have to think much more about how does our data live in these super data-rich and data-driven mixed media information environments, actually, right? And I think that the borders between media and devices are dissolving, and so we have to think about all that. And again, coming to that point is that data visualization does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't make much sense to look at it in an isolated fashion and just pretend there's nothing outside these chart borders, right? And I hope I was able to show you a bit today that data visualization is also inseparably tied, always, to questions of its content, its media, the emotions, the feelings, the how, and also the culture surrounding it, the framing, the social attitudes, what everybody expects, stuff like that. And if you communicate in these contexts, tone and voice, associations, and context do matter quite a lot. And again, it's something we have a good grasp on in language. If you say, have a nice day, that's perfectly nice and fine. But if you say, enjoy your next 24 hours, that's downright creepy, you know? It's the same thing factually, but the delivery, the how, changes the what. It's not just some modifier, it actually affects the meaning, yeah? The semantics change through the tone. And I think we have the same in data visualization. Classic example is this, Iraq's bloody toll. If you flip it around, make it blue, give it a different heading, it's a different chart with a different frame. And you could still say, oh, this is how the styling affects maybe the effective reading. I think it even affects what people are looking for in the chart. It's what people will identify as patterns. And I think there's recent research pointing to that top-down expectations and framing affect low-level perceptual processes and actual recognition of patterns. And so we cannot just leave it out or say, oh, it's another modifier on top, this affective side, the emotional side, because it actually changes what we see at all, what we're even looking for. And again, it's also for more complex graphics. If you show a phylogenetic tree like this, or if you show it like this, people will totally take away different things from that, right? It's structurally maybe the same visualization, but it's a different thing, right? And hopefully that also rings now a bell for all of you who have been relaxed and laying back. It's like, oh, he's just talking about communication, you know? I don't do that. I do tools, you know? So like, it doesn't apply to me. Actually, it does apply to all of you. Think again, because also tools are media, you know, and convey stuff. And just as a quick last example, the peak spotting tool we built for Deutsche Bahn, super applied. Really, it's a sort of classic visual analytics application where people can see how busy certain trains are, where the bottlenecks are, drill down to the different levels, whatever. So it's really, really functional and applied, used by just 10 experts, you know, and yeah, it's not a communication exercise, right? But when we designed it, we really thought a lot about what is the fundamental visual language we are using. How is it specific to the domain, of course? Why is it good for trains? It wouldn't work for planes. It wouldn't work for cars, right? It's really tailored to trains. But it also reflects the organization's attitude towards that data. Like, what is an alarming data point? What is within the range of normal, right? All these things you have to be really careful about. And all this expresses attitude and emotion. And the other thing is, if you're strict about your visual language, if you think about the pictures also, the pictures you produce, only that allows you to also give the project an identity of its own and a life of its own, right? Because people will recognize the tool through the pictures. There's a screenshot somewhere in a presentation, and somebody will either say, that looks like a generic run-of-the-mill visual analytics application, or, oh yeah, that's that load balancing tool. I've seen that before, right? And so the power of the picture itself is important, and only that gives you adoption internally and gives you traction internally to have people use it, but also gives you outsiders the feeling there's something substantial happening here. And the funny thing is, if you look at the subtitle again, people told us they had tears in their eyes because they could finally see what was happening, right? And it's, again, just the feeling people have from finally having an overview. It's not about what it achieved business-wise. It's how did it make people feel, right? And so, just to conclude, whenever somebody comes to you with that old chestnut, which is still true, keep in mind, data visualization doesn't end there, right? So of course, insights, totally, yes, this is where it all starts, right? This is where it all starts, but this is not the end. The interesting stuff happens afterwards, right? And it's all these things we just seen, right? Empathy, joy, curiosity, identity, community, and all these other powerful things data visualization can do, right? We don't throw insights out of the window, but we work with them, right, in that emotional sense. And I think only if we understand how all of this comes together, we will be really able to understand what it really means to master that craft, to master that art of data visualization, to what it really means to speak that language natively, to master that medium. And again, final reference to linguistics. I think in linguistics, it's very established that we have syntax, semantics, phonology, morphology, pragmatic, speech act theory, social linguistics, the whole spectrum of very low-level building blocks to big societal roles of this thing. And I think in data visualization, sometimes we're just scratching the surface and staying in the cozy syntax and semantics corner because the rest is so messy. But I think it's just so worthwhile to investigate all the rest as well. And yeah, and I think in order to really create truly memorable, meaningful, impactful information experiences, we just need to understand more about this messy, emotional, personal, and societal part of data visualization. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting talk. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes. Just a second.
Thank you. Hi. Can you hear me? 1, 2. Yeah.
Yes.
No? Yes. Yeah, great. I really like your talk, Moritz. But so I'm a kind of lame researcher trying to do crude visualization, and I really like your idea about engagement and with visualization. But I have a question for you about the difference between engagement and entertainment. Because I guess people in the social media want entertainment. So my fear is if we do joyful, nice, engaging visualization, they will become entertaining and I feel people don't get through. So there's been a couple of articles showing that there was a difference between people being like entertained by a visualization and taking actions according to the visualization. And so what would be your take on not only entertaining people and making them feel, wow, this is great, but also taking actions? Because right now I see really a strong difference between people looking at the numbers of COVID saying 300, oh yeah, but not doing anything about it, versus people saying, wow, 300, that's really a lot. We should really do something about it. Even not looking at fancy visualization with blood flowing, something like that. So what's your take on this issue between engagement and superficial entertainment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first part is, again, acknowledging that there's many styles of data visualization. So I think for a few years, everybody was like, oh, it needs to be data ink ratio maximized. And I think by now we realize, yeah, Tufty is one style of visualization, might be appropriate in this context. Data physicalization is another style of visualization, different trade-offs, right? And now we understand more, okay, there's different ways you can express the same basic statistics, there's different ways you can use that medium. The second question is then, what is best suited for what purpose? And I think the challenge often is in communication exercises is that the goal is very unclear in definition. So it's easier to formulate, we want to raise revenues by 3%, and then you have a hard target you can measure against, like metrics, KPIs. In communication context, it's often a bit more fuzzy. It's like, we want to raise awareness, we want to make sure people get the message, you know? And then if you don't have a clear metric to work against, it's very, or at least you have never decided if it's actually more important to you to reach 1 million people for 10 seconds or 100 people for 10 minutes, you know? Then, of course, you cannot really evaluate your solution. So I think the key is really to understand what your goal is. And when I work with clients, I always push for that objective. Why are we even doing this? A, does it have to be a data visualization, right? Could we achieve the same thing otherwise? And if it has to be a data visualization, why are we doing this? What are we hoping to achieve? And then you can evaluate afterwards against these goals. But often the problem is the goal is not clear. On the case of the IMF dashboard, I mean, we were part of a really complex, messy situation in terms of communication of the Ministry of Health, in terms of mass media, different newspapers not playing great roles. So it is really hard to untangle what your benefit was. And I think you have to get very qualitative there and sort of collect individual voices and sort of do more. It's hard to do a quantitative evaluation of a communication exercise like this. But we had, just to add to that, we had clear goals laid out at the beginning, and we worked towards them. So internally, there was this clear role we were striving for, which we fulfilled.
Hi, so I'm Vidya from Tableau Research. Enjoyed your talk.
Now it's difficult to hear. Can you just
Hello?
down the mask?
Better? Okay. Yeah, Moritz, thanks for your talk. I'm Vidya Settler from Tableau Research. I really liked the fact that you introduced the notion of pragmatics and semiotics and semantics and how that's really important for visual communication. So my question to you is, given your work now in the practitioner side of things, moving away from just core academic research, what advice would you give to the academic community in terms of bridging the gap or addressing problems that come into play when we are taking data and trying to communicate that through a particular medium or for a particular goal, drawing inspiration from language? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I actually don't want to be too prescriptive here because I think you all know best now how to transfer that basic idea to your different fields of practice. I mean, in general, I think what I'm after is just maybe sort of, putting in your mind that this aspect of experience and user experience and human factors, it's established in general in HCI, and maybe it could be more reflected in the DataVis slice of HCI. I think that's one concrete thought here. It's like it could be a part of evaluations of data visualizations. It's just the associations people have and how they describe their feelings towards the work. I don't read that much, but maybe I just read the wrong papers basically there. And the other bigger questions are, of course, how do we relate to wider theories like media theory, semiotics, all these kinds of research. But again, I'm not a scholar. I'm just doing the work. But I can also say, from a practitioner side, it would be great to have more guidelines and best practice reports from academia there. For instance, whenever I have to come up with a color scheme for good and bad, I'm like, I wish I just had a few papers I could point to, where it not just says red and green is sort of not ideal, but more the trade-offs of different alternatives, good, bad color schemes. It's a very practical question everybody designing dashboards has, basically, and I feel we just need to wing it, which we do most of the time.
One more question.
Michael Krone. Oh, is this on? Okay. Michael Krone, University of Tübingen. I really enjoyed your talk, and I really enjoyed the examples for data physicalization that you showed, the flags and also the food stuff. But I, like many people here in the room, mainly work with interactive system or on interactive visualization systems. So what are your thoughts or ideas for data physicalization for flexible interactive visualization system? Do you think something like, for example, augmented reality could be at least...
I have trouble understanding. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Do you think for the data physicalization, for interactive data visualization systems, flexible systems, do you think something, for example, like augmented reality could be like, for example, a cheap substitute for real physicalization? Or do you have any other thoughts how physicalization and this engagement that comes from it could be transferred to such an interactive data visualization?
Is it about the transferability of what we learned in communication context to more tools and exploratory?
No, more like how can we... I mean, this data physicalization creates, like you showed in the examples, a lot of engagement and makes, like, that data more digestible, more tangible. Yeah. And that helps people to relate to it. But how do we do that for an interactive system, where I can just, my user just loads his or her data into it, wants to analyze it, so they have a real task, but they should hopefully benefit from such physicalization, tangible visualizations. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think there's always something you can transfer also to other media. So if you think about what do people like about the food thing, right? You can pull out individual aspects, and it might be the central experience, it might be the human scale, it might be the social aspect, right? And you could always think about how would I realize that specific aspect on a tablet screen if I went for it? How would I realize that in VR? How would I realize that in print? Because in the end, it's about the feeling, but you can evoke that feeling in different ways. And so I think the first thing is really recognizing what types of emotional effect am I going for, or what type of catalyst, role I want to play. And then I think in each medium, there's always a way to do it. And it has a lot to do with just triggering the right associations and illusions and evoking known contexts, and you just need to point to them. It's often just a little thing. And for instance, I mean, there's a classic study from the 80s, that people judged information as more relevant if the clipboard was heavier on which it was carried. So physical weight translates into perceived importance, right? But you can also give things graphical weight, right? And like a dark, big blob looks heavy. You can always transfer these things into different media. That's the beauty of media. But I don't know if maybe there's a whole PhD on bijective mapping between media and effective effects. I don't know. Yeah.
Probably more than one. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
See you in 4 years. Keep me updated on that. Yeah.
Thank you. We are running a bit late, so we stop here with the questions, and you can enjoy the coffee break now. That is, I don't know exactly where, but Beppe will tell us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, we are 10 minutes late. I suggest to not compress the coffee break. We can compress the lunch. So we can start the next session 10 minutes later, 20 minutes past 11. And thank you for being here, and enjoy the coffee break outside.